He looked at her the same way, the same angle, the same calculation behind the eyes, that particular gaze that measures before it speaks, that takes inventory of a room before it decides what it wants from the room. She had seen it once before, 300 years ago, on the face of a man who had walked into her court carrying someone else's grief, disguised as ambition, asking for something she had refused, leaving with nothing, dying without an answer. And now here it was again. Same gaze, different face. 22 years old, standing 3 deliberate feet from her door, with a false name and a dying sister, and 300 years of someone else's unfinished business, moving through his blood like a current he had never been taught to name. The Order had waited 3 centuries for this moment. They had trained him. They had told him what to say. They had given him the word that would open her attention, the word no one outside a very small circle had spoken aloud in 300 years, and they had not told him everything. They never told the young men everything. What was behind the wall in the inner sanctum? What did Castor leave that was worth 300 years of patience to retrieve? And why? After 30 decades of silence, had someone decided that today was the day to send a young man through the wrong door with the right gaze and a name she had not heard since the morning everything changed? If this story pulled you in, like the video and follow Medusa's Memories. Tell us, what state are you listening from? The first time she saw that gaze, it had belonged to a man who believed he could outrun his own ruin. His name was Castor. He had come to Medusa's court 300 years ago with the particular confidence of someone who had never been truly denied anything, a confidence so deep it had calcified into a kind of armor, shining and impenetrable from a distance, brittle as old bone up close. He stood in her throne room the way young men of power always stand, legs slightly apart, chin slightly raised, one hand resting at his belt, as though reaching for something that was no longer there. He looked at her the way no mortal was supposed to look at her, not with fear, not with awe, but with the flat, assessing calculation of a man deciding whether a thing was worth wanting. Medusa had seen 10,000 men in her long existence. She had watched them arrive at her gates, carrying their ambitions like luggage they couldn't set down. She had watched them speak the language of supplication, while their eyes spoke the language of conquest. She had learned, across centuries, to read the precise distance between what a man said and what a man meant, and Castor's distance was so vast it almost deserved to be admired. He wanted her power, not her counsel, not her blessing. Her power, extracted and made portable, the way a thief wants a painting removed from its frame. She had not given it to him. She had offered him something else, wisdom, which is slower than power and infinitely more dangerous, and he had refused with the kind of polite contempt reserved for gifts that disappoint. He had left her court that morning with his ambitions intact and his armor unscratched. And she had watched him go from the high window above the eastern gate, and she had thought, he will come back. They always come back. He had not in his own body, not in his own time. 300 years had passed since that morning. 300 years of smaller men with the same hunger in their eyes. 300 years of watching the particular shape of ambition evolve, its methods changing, its instruments changing, its vocabulary growing more sophisticated, while its fundamental nature stayed constant as stone. Men wanting what was not theirs. Men looking at what they could not have with the eyes of someone already calculating the cost of taking it anyway. And now there was Leander. He arrived on the morning of the winter solstice, when the light fell at such a sharp angle that every shadow in the kingdom stretched itself long and thin across the frozen ground. He was younger than Castor had been, perhaps 22, perhaps 23, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that might have been accidental and almost certainly was not. He had the lean, watchful quality of someone who had survived a childhood that required vigilance. There was something in the set of his jaw that spoke of early hardship made into discipline, not the softness of privilege, but the particular sharpness of a young man who had decided, at some early age, that the world owed him compensation for its initial unkindness. He had come, ostensibly, as a messenger. A minor lord in the eastern provinces had sent him with a sealed letter requesting an audience, a routine matter. The kind of administrative correspondence that moved through Medusa's court like tides, constant and forgettable. Leander was meant to deliver the letter and wait in the outer hall with the other messengers. While the court's secretaries processed the request, he did not wait in the outer hall. He moved through the palace with the casual ease of someone who had rehearsed the route. Not hurrying. Hurrying attracted attention, but moving with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of a man who belonged wherever he happened to be. He passed to guards who should have questioned him and didn't. He passed through the corridor of the inner court, where the walls were hung with tapestries depicting Medusa's history in thread and gold. And he slowed at one particular tapestry, the oldest one, the one that showed the moment before everything changed, and he looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Medusa watched him from the shadows of the upper gallery. She watched the way his eyes moved across the tapestry's surface, not with the wonder of a visitor encountering beauty, but with the focused attention of someone reading a map. She watched his lips move slightly, as though he were counting something. She watched him reach out and touch the edge of the tapestry's frame, a single finger, barely making contact, before withdrawing his hand and continuing down the corridor as though nothing had happened. The serpents in her hair stirred. They always knew. By the time Leander reached the inner sanctum, the room he had no clearance to enter, the room that required 2 separate seals of authorization even for high court officials, Medusa had descended from the gallery and was standing at its entrance, waiting. He stopped 3 feet from her. The distance was exactly 3 feet. She noted this. A man who kept 3 feet of distance was a man who had measured the space in advance, decided that 3 feet was far enough to signal respect and close enough to signal intimacy, and calibrated his arrival accordingly. 3 feet was not accident. 3 feet was architecture. He looked at her, and there it was, that gaze. That particular gaze she had not seen in 300 years. The one that Castor had worn like a second face over his real one. The gaze that looked at her and saw not a person, not a queen. Not a being who had existed longer than the civilizations that had built and collapsed around her, but a resource. A source. A mechanism that, properly understood and properly operated, could be made to produce something useful. Castor had worn that gaze. And Castor, 300 years ago, had not come alone. Medusa stood very still while this understanding moved through her like cold water finding the lowest place, in the ground. She had allowed herself to assume, that Castor's story had ended when he walked away from her court with his ambitions intact and his request denied. She had watched him leave and thought, the danger passes with the man. She had been wrong. She had been, in the way that only the very old can be wrong. Wrong in a direction that took 3 centuries to fully reveal itself. Leander's gaze was Castor's gaze, not metaphorically, not in the vague, poetic sense in which all ambitious young men resemble one another. The gaze was identical in its quality, its angle, its particular mixture of calculation and hunger. It was the gaze of someone who had been told, since childhood, that this door would open for him, who had been handed a story about himself, in which he was always the one who took the thing that others could not take. Castor had told someone about this door. He had told someone what he had seen, what he had learned, what he had nearly touched before it was denied to him. And that someone had waited, had kept the story alive through generations, passing it down the way certain families pass down grudges, not as wounds but as missions, not as losses but as debts waiting to be collected. 300 years. Whoever they were, whatever name they called themselves now, whatever shape their ambition had taken across 3 centuries of patience, they had been waiting 300 years for someone with Castor's precise combination of skill and need and hunger, someone young enough to still believe in the story, someone desperate enough to try the door. They had been watching her. "You have a letter for the court secretaries," Medusa said. Her voice was very calm. "The outer hall is to the left of the main gate." Leander's expression did not change. "I thought the inner sanctum might be faster." "It is not accessible to messengers. I am not only a messenger." He said it without defiance, without apology. Matter of fact, the way someone states a thing they have accepted about themselves. He was not only a messenger, he was something else. Something that had been traveling toward this door for longer than he had been alive, carried here on a current of someone else's unfinished business. Medusa looked at him for a long moment. The serpents in her hair moved in slow, deliberate patterns, the way they moved when they were thinking. "No," she said. "I suppose you are not." She opened the door to the inner sanctum. She did not step aside. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with the full weight of 300 years behind her eyes. And she waited for him to understand what he was walking into. He understood nothing. He was 22 years old, and someone had told him a story, and he had believed every word of it. And he walked through the door with Castor's gaze on his face, and his hands perfectly still at his sides, already calculating the distance between where he stood and what he wanted. The door closed behind him, and Medusa stood in the center of the room she had inhabited for 3 centuries, in the room that held the thing everyone wanted, in the room that had watched a dozen men with a dozen versions of the same hunger arrive and leave changed or broken or both. And she thought, here it is again. Erie comes come. The way it always comes, not as a surprise, but as a thing you knew was arriving. A thing you watched approach from a great distance. A thing that changes nothing about its arrival by being expected. Leander stood with his back straight and his eyes moving across the room's contents with that precise, cataloguing attention she had seen from the gallery above. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the objects on the shelves. He looked at the walls, at the floor, at the particular geometry of the room's construction, which was older than the palace around it, which had been built to specifications that no architect living could have read. He was looking for something specific. He knew exactly what it was. "Who sent you?" "MEDUSA'S." He answered with a name she didn't recognize, which meant the name was false. She had expected nothing different. The people who sent men like Leander through doors like this one had been managing their anonymity for 300 years. They were not careless with names. "And what," she said, "do they believe is in this room?" Leander turned to face her. For the first time since he had entered, something shifted in his expression, not uncertainty exactly, but the faint flicker of a man reassessing the terrain, recalibrating. He had expected, perhaps, more surprise from her. More reaction. He had walked through a door that no messenger should have been able to walk through, had given a false name without hesitation, had stated with calm certainty that he was not only what he claimed to be, and she had responded to all of it with the same unhurried stillness. As though this conversation had already happened somewhere, and she was simply watching it replay. "They believe," he said carefully, "that there is something in this room that belonged to someone else before it belonged to you." The serpent stilled. Medusa went very quiet inside, the deep quiet of someone standing at the edge of something enormous, feeling its depth before looking down. "And who," she said, "do they believe it belonged to before?" Leander's jaw tightened. Once. Just slightly. But she had 300 years of practice, reading the small movements of people who did not want to be read. He knew the name. He had been told the name. He was deciding whether to say it. "Castor," he said. The room breathed. Medusa stood in the center of the oldest room in her palace, with the winter light falling through the high windows at its sharp solstice angle. And she looked at this young man who had been sent by someone who had waited 300 years to say that name in this room. And she felt the precise shape of what was coming begin to take form, not as fear, not as dread, but as a kind of terrible, ancient recognition. She had seen this gaze before. She had sent it away. She had believed the story was over. It was not over. It had never been over. It had been gathering itself in the dark for 300 years, patient as water, quiet as rust, waiting for a young man desperate enough to carry it through this door and say that name in this room and begin whatever came next. Whatever came next would not be simple. It never was with the old stories. It never was with the old hungers. They didn't end when you turned them away. They only changed shape. "Sit down," Medusa said. It was not an invitation. It was the opening move of a game she had not chosen and could not refuse. The first word of a conversation that had been waiting 300 years to begin. The sound of something ancient and unfinished shifting in its sleep and opening its eyes. Leander sat. Outside, the winter solstice light moved across the frozen ground and stretched, the shadows long and thin and inevitable toward the east. And somewhere, in the web of it all, somewhere in the architecture of what had been set in motion 30 decades ago, the people who had sent him were already waiting for word that he had made it through the door. He had made it through the door. That was what they wanted. That was the first step. And in Medusa's long experience of ambitions built over centuries, the first step was always the most dangerous, not because of what it took, but because of what it promised. It promised everything. It promised completion. It promised that the 300 years of waiting had meant something, had been building towards something real and obtainable and finally close. She had to let him believe that. For now, she had to let him believe exactly that. Leander sat in the chair across from her and told her a story. He told it carefully, the way someone tells a story they have been rehearsing for years. The pauses in the right places, the weight distributed evenly, none of the seams showing. He had been prepared for this moment since before he could fully articulate what preparation meant. Someone had been preparing him. The story he told was this. 300 years ago, Castor had come to Medusa's court carrying something that was not his. A key, not a physical key, or not only a physical key, but the concept of a key. The knowledge of an opening that could be made if the right combination of approach and timing and understanding were assembled. Castor had not brought this knowledge on his own initiative. He had been sent. He had been sent by an order, a very old order, older than Castor himself. Older than the particular generation that had trained him, an order that had been waiting. Since a time Leander did not specify, for access to something Medusa possessed. "What something?" she asked. Leander looked at her with Castor's gaze and said, "The memory." The serpents in her hair moved as one. She had not heard that word spoken aloud in 300 years. She had almost allowed herself to believe that the people who knew what it meant had died out, had been swallowed by the same centuries that had swallowed Castor. Almost. Who told you that word? She asked. The order, he said. She did know the shape of it. That was the problem. She had known its shape for 300 years. Carrying the knowledge of it the way you carry a stone in your shoe, always present. Always slightly wrong, always there at the edge of your awareness, when the silence got too deep. The order had no single name. It had accumulated names the way old things accumulated names, a different one in each century, a different one in each language. In Castor's time, they had called themselves something in a language that was no longer spoken. Now, Leander said, they were simply called the Keepers. She noted this was both accurate and completely wrong. They did not keep things. They catalogued them. They waited for them. They sent young men through doors to retrieve them. What do they believe the memory will give them? She asked. He paused, not the prepared pause, a real one. Continuity, he said finally, an interesting choice. Not power, not victory, not specific concrete outcomes. Continuity, the ongoing of a thing. She studied his face while the words settled between them. He was not lying, she could tell, with 300 years of practice. He believed continuity was what they wanted because someone had told him so. What he did not know, what she could see him not knowing in the particular quality of his certainty, was what continuity in this context actually meant. They had not told him everything. They never told the young men everything. The young men were instruments. Instruments didn't need the full score. I want to show you something, Medusa said. She moved to the far wall of the inner sanctum, the wall that looked, to an unprepared eye, like nothing more than old stone, and placed her palm flat against its center. The surface was cold even through her skin, always cold. Cold for longer than cold had been a concept, with a name. The wall did not open dramatically. There was no grinding of mechanisms. The stone simply became less present, less insistent in its claim to be a wall. And there was a space behind it that had not been there a moment before. Leander stood up. The quick, involuntary motion of a man whose body had responded before his mind authorized it. His hands were very still at his sides. His face cycling through expressions too quickly to name, not fear, not excitement, but the feeling that lives in the space between them. I am going to tell you something, Medusa said. Listen to all of it before you decide what to do with what you hear. He nodded. 300 years ago, Castor came here. He sat where you are sitting. He looked at this wall. He told me who sent him and what they wanted. He asked me to give him what they had sent him for. She paused. I refused. Leander said nothing. He left. He went back to the order and told them I had refused. And send a man who sent another 1 year. They waited. 300 years. They decided patience was the instrument Castor's generation had not thought to use. They waited until they had something better than a man with a demand. They waited until they had a man with a reason. What reason do I have? You tell me. A silence. The cold pressed in from the wall behind her. My family, he said. She had known, from the moment he entered, that there was a family somewhere in this. There was always a family. The Order had learned that a young man with a demand was a man who could be refused. A young man with a dying sister, that was a different kind of instrument. Who is it? She asked. My sister. He said it with the quality of a thing he had been not saying all morning. She's 17. There's something wrong with her. that none of the healers have been able to name. She's been losing ground for 2 years. They think he stopped. They think she won't survive another winter. And the order told you the memory could save her. Something moved through his expression, a flash of shame, or the recognition of being seen in a way he wasn't prepared for. They said it was possible. They said it was possible. Not guaranteed. Not certain. Possible. It's more than the healers gave us. She turned the sentence over. It was more than the healers gave us. How a sentence like that could function as the foundation of an entire decision tree. How everything, the training, the false name, the walk through the palace, the 3 feet of calculated distance could be built on it. Tell me what exactly they told you the memory was, she said. Leander measured her tone, measuring the question to determine whether it was the question of someone who was going to help him or someone building toward a refusal. A record, he said, of everything, of everyone who ever came here, ever asked you something. They said it was a record of every decision ever made in this room, every choice, every consequence. That if you accessed it, you could see which path had worked before. In situations like my sister's, Medusa was quiet. That is what they told you, she said. Yes, and that is not what the memory is. Leander's hands, which had been so still all morning, moved slightly, a small adjustment of tension in the fingers. What is it? He asked. Not a record of choices. Not a library of consequences. Not something you can consult, the way you consult a physician. She moved toward the center of the room. The memory is what I carry. It is not separate from me. It cannot be removed and used. It is limiting snarpo. You cannot take it, and no one sent by the order can take it. And 300 years from now, if they send another young man with another dying sister, the answer will be exactly the same. Leander stared at her. They told you it could be taken, he said. They told you what you needed to believe to get you through that door. Your sister is genuinely ill, that I do not doubt. But the solution they offered you was the instrument of your desperation. That was the key they used on you, Leander. The Waycaster was a key they used on this door. He sat down. Not deliberate sitting, the collapse of someone whose legs have stopped cooperating with the story they were living inside. Then why did you bring me in here? Why show me the wall? Why not send me away at the gate? It was the question underneath all the other questions. Because I need to understand something about what was done to Castor. She paused. When he left, 300 years ago, I believed the story was over. I believed that because I understood Castor, his hunger, his impatience, his inability to work slowly. He was not the kind of man who built things over centuries, but something changed him. Something turned a man who wanted immediate results into the origin point of a 300-year project. I need to understand what that something was. She paused. Because whatever it was, it is the real thing they have been building toward. Not the memory. And you are not a messenger, and you are not a thief. But you might, if you are willing, be something more useful than either. Outside, the winter light had shifted. The long shadows had moved. The palace was beginning its midday activity, the sound of it filtering through the thick walls in muted waves. Leander looked at his hands for a long moment. What happened to Castor? I asked. The right question. Not what do you want from me? Not what's in it for me. What happened to Castor? He was asking because something in what she had said had made him realize. In the way a young man realizes things he should perhaps have known sooner, that the story he'd been handed was incomplete. That 300 years of multi-generational patience required a wound deeper than disappointment. I don't know, Medusa said. That is what I need to find out, and you may be the only path I have. The cold from the wall moved through the room like a slow tide. What would you need me to do? Leander asked. She looked at him with 300 years of accumulated sight and saw, for the first time, something other than Castor's gaze behind his eyes. Something young and frightened and genuinely desperate, not manufactured desperation, but the real, human desperation of a person who loves someone and is running out of time. She could work with that. Go back to whoever sent you. Tell them you found the room. Tell them you saw the wall. Tell them you made contact. Give them enough that they believe the 300 years of patience is about to pay off. She paused. Then come back before the dawn bell and tell me everything you know about Castor, every detail, however small. I will tell you, in exchange, whether there is anything in what I actually carry that might help your sister. Is that a promise? It is the first honest offer you have received today. I will let you decide whether that is the same thing. He left. He moved back through the palace with the same deliberate ease. But something was different now, a slight imprecision. A fraction of the calculation missing, as though a small but essential component of the mechanism had been disturbed. Medusa watched him go from the window above the inner sanctum. The serpents tasted what was coming. Something was coming. From behind Leander, from the people who had built and aimed and sent him, they would receive his report tonight. They would know their instrument had made contact, had found the room, had made the first move in whatever the endgame actually was. And then they would make a move of their own. She had one day to understand what had happened to Castor. One day before the second step took its shape and the game moved past the point where understanding it would still be useful. She turned from the window. 300 years. She had been wrong about the danger passing with the man. She would not be wrong again. He came back before the dawn bell. 2 hours before, which meant he hadn't slept. Medusa was already in the inner sanctum when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She had been there since midnight, working through what she knew and what she didn't, arranging the architecture of what 300 years of patient waiting implied. She opened the door before he knocked. His face had changed overnight. The calibration was still there. Most of it. The trained control of a young man who had been taught that composure was power. But there were cracks now, fine lines of something that hadn't been there the day before. The look of someone who had reported to their handlers and received instructions they hadn't anticipated. They know, he said, the moment she opened the door. Know what, specifically, that you know. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited. I reported, the way you said. I told them I found the room. I saw the wall. I made contact. And the woman who received my report said, tell us what she offered you. Not what did she say. Tell us what she offered you. As though they already knew. Because they know me, Medusa said. They have been studying me for 300 years. They knew if I simply wanted to end the conversation, I would have ended it at the door. They knew if I engaged, I would make an offer. That is how I operate. Counter-movement. Exchange. They know my patterns the way a chess player knows their opponent's preferred openings. Then the offer was a trap. The offer was genuine. But the fact that they anticipated it, that is information. She moved toward the center of the room. What did she tell you? He exhaled. She said the mission had changed. That the original objective, the memory, the access, she said that was a first layer. A way of getting me close enough to you for the second layer. What is the second layer? He looked at her directly, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not the calculated gaze of Castor's training, but something rawer. A young man who had just realized the people who raised him had been using him as a delivery mechanism for something he didn't fully understand. She said to tell you that Castor left a debt. That you owe him a hearing. The cold from the wall moved through the room. Medusa stood very still. You owe him a hearing. She turned the sentence over slowly, feeling for its edges. Castor left a debt. It implied he had a claim. That the refusal had not been the end of something but the beginning of something. That 300 years of multi-generational preparation had not been building toward taking the memory, but toward a moment where she would have to sit down and hear whatever Castor had believed she owed him. What did Castor want? She asked. Not what the Order wanted. What did Castor himself believe he was owed? Leander's hands moved for the first time. Genuine restlessness. A man working through something in real time. They told me he came here because of his daughter. The word landed in the room with weight. His daughter, Medusa repeated. She was ill. The same kind of illness. The same progression. The same failure of the healers to name it. She was 17 when he came here. He believed the memory could save her. Leander's voice had gone flat. He was wrong about what the memory was, the same way I was. He was told a false version. But when you refused him, when he left empty-handed and his daughter, when she died, spent the rest of his life documenting everything. Every approach, every healer, every conversation. He turned his failure into a record. A real record, practical and specific. A working account of what he had learned and what it cost. Medusa was quiet. And the Order has this record, she said. They are the Order. They were founded by Castor's daughter's memory, after she died. Every generation that has carried this mission forward has been families, mostly, of people whose histories intersected with the same illness. Different names for it across 300 years. Same progression, same failure. He stopped. His voice had found a rough edge. My sister. This is not a coincidence. They found me because of my sister, because my family's history matched the pattern they've been tracking for 300 years. Because we were the pattern, the room held its breath. Medusa understood now. Not the hunger, not the Order as a power-seeking organization, a grief organization. 300 years of people carrying the same loss, in different bodies, transmitting it forward because the loss had never been answered, never given what it needed to transform into something other than itself. Castor had come seeking a miracle for his daughter. She had refused, not cruelly, but refused. His daughter had died, and Castor had spent the rest of his life doing the only thing grief knows how to do when it cannot resolve. It documents. It builds. It turns the unbearable into a project, because projects have forward motion, and forward motion is the only thing that makes the unbearable survivable. 300 years later, the project was here. She was angry. Not with Castor's grief, not with the generations who had kept the mission alive, but with the assumption, the 300-year assumption that she would refuse. That her answer was no before the question was asked. That the only way to approach her was through misdirection because direct request was presumed to be wasted. 300 years of being presumed unapproachable. What does the second layer require? She asked. The record, Leander said. Castor's record. They want to give it to you. That is what the second layer is. Not a taking, a giving. They want you to read what Castor built, and they want you to add to it, whatever you know. Whatever you've seen in 300 years that might be relevant to this specific illness. They believe the combination of what Castor documented and what you've witnessed could finally identify what this thing is. Name it. Find a way to stop it. Medusa was quiet for a long time. Why not simply ask me this? She said. Why not come to my court, present Castor's name and his record, and ask if I would contribute? Why 300 years of training young men to find rooms they weren't supposed to find? Leander looked at her. Because you refused him, he said. And the order believed that if they asked directly, you would refuse again. That the only way to get close enough to ask was to make you think you were being approached for something else entirely. The logic was terrible in its completeness, and she could not say it was entirely wrong. She had developed, without quite intending to, the reputation of a keeper who did not share what she kept. The Order had watched this pattern across 300 years and built an indirect approach. 300 years of indirection, culminating in a young man with a dying sister and Castor's gaze and a name she hadn't heard since the morning everything changed. Take me to the record, Medusa said. Leander blinked. What? Castor's record, wherever the Order keeps it. Taking me today for they have time to calculate what engagement means and prepare the next layer. She moved toward the door. Take me to the people who have been waiting 300 years to give me something. Because I am ready to receive it, and I am ready to give something in return. And we are going to have this conversation without the elaborate architecture of approach. Something happened on Leander's face, the expression of a man who had prepared himself for something difficult and found the difficulty had shifted into something he didn't quite have a category for. They don't receive visitors, he said. They operate through intermediaries. I've never even. Then we will be the first, Medusa said. She walked through the door. He followed. They moved through the palace in the early almost dawn light. Medusa, at a pace that was not urgent but was not unhurried, the pace of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the decision can be unmade. Servants stepped aside automatically in the corridors, reading the quality of forward motion. In the palace's outer courtyard, Leander stopped. They will not expect this. If they feel cornered. I have been managing people who feel cornered for 300 years, Medusa said. What I have not done, apparently, is made myself available enough that cornering me feels unnecessary. She looked at him. Where? He told her. The location was close. Disturbingly close. A house in the craftsman's quarter, unremarkable from the outside. She had walked past it some number of times across the years, seeing only what it wanted to be seen as. A house, a dwelling, one of many, 300 years of proximity. The door opened before they reached it. A woman stood in the doorway, not young, not old. Somewhere in the middle of a life shaped by something serious. With the stillness of a person who has learned to inhabit patience, rather than merely sustain it, she looked at Leander. Then at Medusa. Then she stepped aside. We have waited a long time, she said. I know, Medusa said. I am here now. The interior was quiet and dense with the accumulated presence of a purpose that had been living there for generations. Shelves along every wall. Documents, scrolls, carefully maintained records, copies of copies, the words of the dead transmitted forward through careful hands, that they're of a single kazi. Inside it, protected not in glass or metal but in the specific careful distance people maintain around things they have been guarding long enough. That guarding becomes indistinguishable from loving, a bound document, thick, dense, the work of a lifetime. And then of several more lifetimes of editions, in different hands, Castor's record. Medusa sat down across from it. The woman who had opened the door sat across from her. Around them, gradually, others came. 3, 4, 5 people. moving quietly into the room from the house's inner spaces, taking positions at its edges. Not threateningly, witnessing, the way you witness something you have waited 300 years to see. Castor believed, the woman said, that you refused him because you didn't understand what he was asking for. I understood exactly what he was asking for, Medusa said. I refused because I was wrong about what my refusal would mean. The silence that followed was very specific. The silence of a room full of people who had carried a wound for a very long time and had just heard something they had not expected. Not an apology. Medusa did not apologize for the decision she had made, which had been correct in its own terms, but the acknowledgement of a consequence she had not anticipated. A consequence that had outlasted Castor and his daughter, and the specific grief that had started all of this. I need to read it, Medusa said. All of it. I need to understand what Castor learned that I didn't know, and I need to add what I know that Castor couldn't have seen. And then we need to find a healer or scholar who can use what we put together and give them the complete record. She looked at Leander, standing near the door. Your sister has time, she said. Not a great deal, but enough. The woman across from her opened the case. She laid the record on the table between them. It was heavier than it looked. Everything Castor had learned in the years after his daughter died, all of it, here. 300 years of people adding to it. 300 years of the same, unnamed illness, taking the same young lives. And the same families documenting what they had seen, what they had tried, what they had lost. Medusa placed her hands flat on the cover. This was a different kind of cold than the sanctum's wall. The cold of old knowledge, preserved knowledge. The kind of knowledge that survives because someone loved something enough to write it down. She opened the first page, and she began to read. She read for 3 hours. In the house, in the craftsman's quarter, surrounded by people who had been waiting 300 years for this moment. Medusa read Castor's record from the first page to the last and found, inside it, a man she had fundamentally misread. She had remembered him as hunger, as calculation, as the flat, assessing gaze of someone who looked at her power and wanted it the way you want, something that belongs to someone else. She had remembered him correctly, in a technical sense. That was the face he had brought to her court. The armor he had worn to the audience. The performance of confidence, carefully assembled for an encounter he had been preparing for. But the record showed her the man underneath the armor. The man who had come home from her court without what he'd gone for and had sat, presumably, in whatever room held what remained of his daughter, and had decided that the trip had not been wasted because the knowledge he had gathered on the way was still knowledge, and knowledge did not have to stay useless. He had interviewed 47 healers across his lifetime. He had traveled to 6 different kingdoms. He had corresponded with scholars in 3 languages, 2 of which he had learned specifically for the purpose. He had documented every symptom, every treatment, every outcome, with the specific meticulous attention of someone who knows they are building a map for a territory they will not personally need, but that someone, somewhere, will. His daughter's name had been Iris. Medusa had not known that. She had not known it because Castor had not told her in his audience. He had spoken only of power, only of what he wanted, only in the language of request and demand. He had not told her his daughter's name. He had not told her the story underneath the request. He had come to her wearing ambition like a second face, and she had read the second face and sent it away. And the first face, the face of a man whose daughter was named Iris, who was 17, who was dying of something unnamed, that face she had never seen, she could not have known. She understood this. The audience had been what it was. A man asking for power, not a father asking for help, and she had responded to what was presented to her. The grief underneath the performance was real, but hidden, and she was not responsible for what she could not see. And yet, 300 years, Iris, a man who spent the rest of his life building a map for a territory he would never need, because the map might help someone who would. The record contained, in the later editions, the hands from generations after Castor, something she had not anticipated. It contained cases. Documented cases of the illness, yes, but also documented cases of recovery. Partial recoveries. Approaches that had worked, in specific circumstances, for specific presentations of the illness. Approaches that had been discovered piecemeal, across decades, by families who had been sharing information through the network of the order. The record was not, as she had feared, a monument to failure. It was something more complex and more alive than that. It was a working document, still being added to, still being revised, still reaching forward from Castor's grief towards something practical. She spent 2 hours reading, and then she spent 1 hour talking. She told them what she knew. Not the memory, not the mythologized, impossible things she carried that could not be extracted or transferred, but what she had witnessed across 300 years. The cases she had seen that resembled the pattern. The treatments she had watched healers attempt and the outcomes she had observed. The specific combinations she had seen work in the margins of failure. The approaches that arrived late in a progression and bought time without curing. The knowledge that existed only in her accumulated observation and that she had never thought to assemble into a form that anyone else could use. She talked for an hour, someone wrote. At the end of it, the record was heavier. Not dramatically heavier, not transformed, not completed. Not the definitive answer that 300 years of hope had been building toward, but extended, moved forward. Given material it had not had before. This won't be enough on its own, Medusa said to the woman across from her, the woman who had opened the door, who she now understood was the current keeper of the record. In a family that had been keeping records for 300 years. You need someone who can read what Castor built and what I've added and synthesize it. A healer or a scholar with the specific knowledge too. Understand what we've assembled and identify what the pattern means and how to interrupt it. There is someone, the woman said. There has been someone for 10 years. We've been waiting to have enough to bring to her. Then bring it to her, Medusa said. Today, Leander, from his position near the door, exhaled quietly. It was the sound of someone who had been holding tension in their body for a very long time and had found a small release. Not resolution, not certainty, but the movement of something that had been stuck. Medusa looked at him. Your sister's name, she said. He looked startled. What? Tell me her name. A pause. Something moved through his expression, that complicated cycling of emotions she had seen when he first sat down in the chair across from her. Cressida, he said. Cressida, she repeated. She held the name for a moment, the way she held all names, feeling the particular weight of it. The specific gravity of a life attached to a collection of sounds, the way a name carries the whole of a person even when the person is absent. Iris died, Medusa said. Castor could not save her with what he had. What he had was not enough, and he was wrong about where to find more, and she died. She paused, but he was not wrong about the direction. He was just one step early, 300 years early, and the people who came after him understood that. And they kept building in the direction he had pointed, because they knew the direction was right, even if the timing was wrong. She looked at Leander steadily. Cressida is not early. Cressida is exactly when she is supposed to be, at the end of 300 years of preparation that was always. Ultimately, building toward her, even if none of the people building it knew her name yet. Leander's throat worked. He didn't speak. The woman across the table stood. "I will take the record to the scholar today," she said. "And I will send word to you." She looked at Leander. As soon as there is word to send, she looked at Medusa. "What do we tell the others?" she said. "The order. There are more than the people in this room. They have been operating for 300 years on the belief that the memory was something that could be retrieved. Some of them are not going to. The belief is old. It has become part of the identity. Tell them the truth," Medusa said. "Tell them what the memory actually is. Tell them that the man who first sought it was a man in grief, who was given a false account of what he was looking for, by people whose purposes did not align with his own. Tell them that the thing they have been building, the real thing, the record, the knowledge, the network of families who shared information and kept the mission alive across 3 centuries. That is more valuable than anything they believed was in my sanctum. Tell them they were not wrong to keep building. Tell them they built exactly what was needed. Shist. And tell them," she said, "that if there is something in what I carry that is useful in the actual sense, the practical sense, the sense of someone who needs help rather than power, my door is open. It has always been open. I was simply, for a very long time, not asked the right question." She walked to the door. Outside, the morning had arrived fully. Not the sharp, solstice angle of the day before, but a slightly warmer, slightly fuller quality of light, the day after the shortest day, the first morning of the return. Medusa stood in the doorway of the craftsman's house and let the morning settle against her. The serpents in her hair moved slowly, reading the air. She had made an error 300 years ago. Not the refusal had been correct. But the assumption behind the refusal. The assumption that the conversation was over when the man walked away. The assumption that refused ambition was the same as resolved danger. That had been the error. She had watched Castor leave and thought, the story ends here. She had not thought, what does the story become in his hands? What had it become? It had become Iris, documented and mourned and turned into a project. It had become 4 to 7 interviews, and 6 kingdoms and 3 languages, and a record kept by strangers, who were united not by power, but by loss. It had become 300 years of people adding to a map that had been started in grief and expanded in love. The specific love of people who know what it means to watch someone die of something unnamed, and who are not willing to watch it happen again without at least trying to understand why. It had become Leander, standing in her inner sanctum with Castor's eyes and his own desperate, genuine need, not knowing that the gaze he had trained himself to wear, the gaze of calculation and control, was the thinnest possible cover over a 22-year-old who was terrified for his sister. It had become a woman who opened doors. It had become a record, heavier this morning than it was yesterday. It had become something still in motion, still unfinished, still reaching forward. Medusa walked back toward her palace, through the craftsman's quarter, in the early morning light. Past the stalls beginning to open and the fires being lit, and the ordinary daily business of people who would not know. Passing her in the street, that anything had changed. Something had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, not in the way that 300 years of waiting might lead you to expect. No revelation, no transformation, no answer complete and final and solved. Just a step. A single step forward in a direction that had been pointing the same way for 3 centuries. Made slightly more possible by the addition of what she had spent the morning handing over. A step toward Iris, a step toward Cressida, a step toward the unnamed thing being named. In her palazzi, she returned to the inner sanctum and stood for a while in its cold, particular quiet. The wall was as it always was. The room was as it always was. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been removed. Something had been given. She was still standing there when the message came. Not from Leander, from the woman who had opened the door, who had taken the record to the scholar that very morning with the additions, still fresh in the writing. Who had received a response faster than any of them had expected, not Nakuri, but a name, the scholar's name for the illness. The first time in 300 years it had been identified with any specificity. A name and a direction and a possibility that had not existed yesterday. Cressida had time, possibly enough time. Medusa held the message and felt the weight of what had been built across. 300 years converge into this single practical sentence. A name, a direction, a possibility. 300 years of grief turned, finally, into the first edge of an answer. Iris had not been saved. That was true and permanent, and nothing could touch it. Castor had gone home empty-handed and his daughter had died, and the story that had started in that loss had outlasted everyone who had been alive to know why it began. But the story had not ended in silence. The story had built something. Despite everything, despite the misdirections, the false accounts, the generations of people who had to carry something forward without knowing how it would resolve, it had built something real and specific and present. Something that had arrived at this morning and had been used. Medusa set the message down on the cold stone surface of the sanctum's central table. Outside, the solstice light moved across the frozen ground, slightly longer today, the first morning of the return. The serpents in her hair were quiet. Something had been laid down. Something that had been held in the body of 300 years of waiting. Held in the way a sound holds in a bell before the bell is struck, had finally moved, not resolved, not completed, not finished in any tidy or permanent sense, but moved forward in the direction that Castor, in his grief and his persistence, and his fundamental refusal to accept that the knowledge he had gathered was wasted, had pointed. This was what the memory was, not power, not a resource, not something that could be extracted and used. This, the capacity to be present at the end of a long arc of human grief, and recognize it, and give it what was needed, and watch it move one step closer to something better. She had been wrong about the conversation being over when the man walked away. She would not be wrong again. And somewhere in the city, in the home that Leander had traveled from, in the room where a 17-year-old girl named Cressida lay in the particular exhaustion of a body working very hard at the wrong problem, a name was on its way. The first name in 300 years. The beginning, finally, of the map having an edge that touched the territory. The scholar would work through the night. Medusa had made certain of it. The memory was hers to carry, and she would carry it. But she was a being, only a keeper. She was something older than that, something that existed before the language of keeping had been invented. She was a witness. She was the continuity of sight across time. She was the one who had been present at the beginning of Castor's grief and was present now at the first edge of its resolution. 300 years. She had seen that gaze before. She would not see it again. She believed the order had been built on grief. She was wrong about that too. It had been built on a secret caster, had never told her the secret of what he had found. In the months after he left her court, in a place no living person should have been able to enter, the scholar found the reference on the 3rd page of Castor's private letters. The order had not been founded on his daughter's death. It had been founded on what he had seen in the weeks before it. If this story reached your heart, leave us a like and share it. What would you have done? And don't miss what comes next. Another memory Medusa never forgot.